From hot air balloons and bicycles to airplanes and motor cars, not to mention radios, telephones, mass circulation newspapers, and cinema, and television, the world was getting smaller. It turned faster. It became more self-conscious each day. The technological revolution, this time on the Western tradition.
UCLA Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
We're almost ready to conclude our 5,000 years of history, our economy tour through the old country. Although there really is no conclusion, there is no happy ending, there is no eternal damnation, there is no priceless wisdom even, just a little more experience. The human predicament remains essentially the same, but we live it in greater comfort. And that's what I want to remind you of in our last two programs, just how far we've come in material terms at least, if not in any other. At 4 p.m. on April 24, 1900, a balloon rose from the Tuileries Gardens in Paris, while 15,000 people craned their necks to watch. On board the balloon was a pioneer cinematographer, the cinema having been invented 5 or 6 years before. As he went up, he writes, a light wind pushed us eastward. It's from 400 meters that Paris looks its best. Knotted around the ribbon of the Seine, one saw it all, cut up by avenues and boulevards, gullied by its streets and lanes. Since that time, aviation has got us used to this sort of sight. In 1900, it was completely new. You would think that could have happened sooner, since the hot air balloon used in 1900 was an invention of the 18th century. But balloons remained a rare curiosity, while airplanes, when they came, multiplied fast. Within 3 years of 1903, when the Wright brothers got the first airplane off the ground, an aircraft factory in the Paris suburb of Billancourt was turning out good biplanes. By 1908, one of these had made the first cross-country flight in Europe, 27 kilometers, about 15 miles, from Bouilly to Reims in the Champagne. The following year, Louis Blériot would cross the English Channel with no compass by following the ships that steamed between Boulogne and Dover. But then, in 1909, aerial photographs were taken of military installations in northeastern France. And in that same year, 38 airplanes entered the first air meeting held at Reims in the Champagne. Now, this had been organized by the local champagne industry. It offered considerable prizes and it set several records, but the Reims meeting didn't just reflect the publicity value of the new machines, it also suggested their military potential. This was soon demonstrated when in 1911 the Italians, at war with the Turks, began to use planes to scout out enemy positions and also to chuck out bombs by hand. John Galsworthy, the English novelist, wrote a moving letter to the London Times begging the military to leave us the innocence of the air. But the air was destined to be violated like the rest of the earth. Within a couple of years, British troops were being equipped with specially built anti-aircraft guns. And things have never been quite the same since. As we have seen, wars serve as great accelerators. The end of the war in 1918 left lots of useless planes and lots of unemployed pilots. It didn't take long for some of these to start to fly both passengers and mail. 5 years later, flying aces back from World War I offered promenades in the air and also 2-hour flights to and from Paris. By the 1930s, anyone who could afford it could travel or ship goods across the world on regular services. Still, passenger flying remained the prerogative of kings like Edward VIII, dictators, and other exceptional figures until World War II accelerated things once more and turned the luxury of the few into the commonplace transport of the many. Jet engines developed for late model fighter planes and for Hitler's V-1, the Vengeance planes, revealed commercial possibilities. In 1952, BOAC, the British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, introduced the first passenger jet service. By the 1960s, wide-bodied jumbo jets were carrying 600 and 700 passengers. In 1976, the supersonic Concorde, costly triumph for Franco-British engineering, crossed the Atlantic in less than 3 hours. Lindbergh in 1927 took 10 times as long and had to wait for his champagne. Now, if you're flying from Paris to New York, you can get there before you've left. It was impressive to know that men could fly to the moon, but simple commercial flight added a new dimension to the experience of ordinary folk. Now they could cross entire continents with greater speed and ease than it had taken to get from a country town to the capital 100 years before. Jaded as we are today, we might want to give a moment's thought to how and from what all this started. The true origins of heavier-than-air flying machines lie less in the fantasies of Leonardo da Vinci than in humbler and more practical aspirations. In 1889, an Irishman named John Boyd Dunlop, soon followed by the Michelin brothers of France, patented a kind of rubber tire that turned unwieldy, uncomfortable velocipedes into bicycles, safer, easier to ride and to control, and soon much cheaper as well. For the first time in history, man found an alternative to the costly horse, one that permitted him to move much faster than he could do on foot. And woman discovered an emancipating agent, liberating her from constricting corsets, voluminous skirts, and chaperones. As the 19th century ended, as the 20th century began, manufacturers of corset stays and umbrella spokes turned to making bicycles, with such effect that prices dropped within a decade or two to where quite modest folk could afford to buy one. Others, more venturesome, equipped the new contraptions with steam or petrol engines, turning bi, tri, or quadricycles first into motorbikes, then into motor cars, then into flying machines. All of them used much the same parts, and most were produced and raced by the same men and women who were driven by love of gain, but also, and above all, by the spirits of enterprise and adventure, the love of excitement and speed that marks a century not half as mopey as it is sometimes made out. At first, however, the bicycle remained the people's horse. A horse that consumed no hay, required no stable, dropped no manure. Cars took a bit longer. Motorized public transport dates to the beginning of the century, and its appearance drove a British scholar to stately complaint. What is this that roareth thus? Can it be a motor or bus? Yes, the smell and hideous hum indicat motorem bum. How shall wretches live like us, cincto bis motoribus? Domine defende nos contra hos motores bos. Oh, you don't have to understand Latin to know exactly how he felt. In Europe, low-priced cars for the middle classes didn't come until the 1930s, when men like André Citroën adopted and adapted Henry Ford's assembly line methods. Then in 1938, Ferdinand Porsche turned out the first people's car, the Volkswagen, prototype of a post-war family of Morris Minors and Citroën 2-horsepower cars that made automobiles accessible to most. By 1960, there was one private car for every 31 people in the world, one for 3 in the United States, one for 22 in Europe. Predictably, bikes and motor cars also led to more tourist facilities. Inns, restaurants, hotels that now cater to more than just commercial travelers, and they also led to better roads. Rutted, dusty, ill-paved highways were gradually replaced by even surfaces kinder to tires and springs. In 1924, the first high-speed autostrada opened in Italy between Varese and Milan. Italy and Germany pioneered the freeways that the United States was going to perfect. And so Europe and the world moved from the age of animal and foot power to that of motor traction. In 1914, the floods of refugees had pushed hand-barrows or trudged along their horse carts. In 1940, similar refugees filled highways with bikes and cars, fleeing from German tanks, dive-bombed by screaming aircraft. There was no holding back progress. Other goodies were born quite literally with the century. The cheap box camera in 1900, vacuum cleaners in 1901, and also gramophone records. People had made their own music or listened to somebody playing it in a hall or in a public kiosk. Now they could listen to music at will. By 1913, Decca had devised a portable gramophone that could be used in the garden or taken on picnics, and that didn't cost more than a Sunday lunch. Soon, that would prove a boon in the trenches. In 1901, an Italian, Guglielmo Marconi, also achieved the first wireless communication across the Atlantic. By 1912, when the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic with 1,600 souls, the miraculous possibilities of modern technology sending out distress signals were revealed along with the fragility of modern technology. Parisians had been talking about pulling down the Eiffel Tower, which had been denounced as an eyesore since 1889. But a radio antenna on top of the tower's 1,000-foot structure ensured its survival. Then, in 1920, Marconi opened the first British broadcasting station near Chelmsford in Essex, soon to become the BBC. Soon also, families would be free from oppressive silences. They could switch on the radio. And after the Second World War, television, which had been demonstrated back in 1926. By 1933, President Roosevelt's fireside chats would demonstrate the political uses of mass communications, and soon Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, Hitler, Churchill would take up the idea. The world was shrinking. More people were traveling and traveling faster. Where the Black Plague of the 14th century had taken months and months to spread through Europe, the flu of 1918 took only a few weeks. At the same time, radios and telephones, another 19th century invention perfected in the 20th, and mass circulation papers and magazines were making the world ever smaller, more stressful, more conscious of what went on next door and beyond. 20th century men and women wake up and go to bed with news from near and far, and since good news is seldom news, the diet of sensationalism makes for indigestion or at least flatulence. Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, lambasted Britain's press lords for wanting power without responsibility, which he described as the prerogative of the harlot through the ages. But the press was far more influential than prostitutes ever were, something Macaulay had predicted in 1828 when he dubbed its reporters the Fourth Estate. And most of the media's power came not from the opinions they expressed, but from the information they conveyed almost unconsciously, information about possibilities, about ways of life and standards and acceptabilities and availabilities that much of the world, whether in far continents or poor streets right here at home, most of the world had long ignored, and that it gradually set to copy. I remember in 1944 seeing the film Mrs. Miniver in an open-air cinema in India. The Indians were watching from the wall and from the trees outside. And I wondered, sitting in that privileged enclosure, looking at the images of such a privileged life, I wondered what the Indians made of the dresses and manners and comforts in the film, so alien to them then, so commonplace by now, 40 years later. And then there was advertising. The 19th century had seen an explosion of publicity, posters, displays that livened city streets. In 1910, the first neon tube was demonstrated in Paris, and it proved ideally suited not just for streetlights, but for advertising too. In 1912, the first neon advertisements went up in Paris for an Italian aperitif, Cinzano. Lights, prints, images, newspapers and reviews, radio and cinema, then television, spurred a revolution of aspirations, the like of which the world had never seen. Modern technology was busy producing ever more things to covet, and modern technology in due course fulfilled many of the aspirations it inspired. More than by its wars, the 20th century stands out by the radical physical difference between its way of life and that of all preceding centuries. The world probably changed no more between the birth of Jesus and 1900 than it has changed from 1900 to the present. And while not all the novelties of our time were devised after 1900, all have been developed and made generally available during the 80 years just past, especially the last 20. And this is as true of neon as of other new devices. Sidewalks and sewers, streetlights and paving, bathrooms and water closets, running water beyond the ground floor, let alone hot and cold running water, gas and electric ranges, all of these were exceptional luxuries before the First World War. Bakelite was invented by a Belgian in 1907, but it wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that plastic objects, furniture, and containers revolutionized industrial design. Telephones were also rare in Europe until after the war. The first dial telephone, the first automatic exchange in Britain, appeared in 1920. And even though the first domestic electrical refrigerator went on sale in Chicago in 1913, milk still turned in summer, and meat still went bad for lack of refrigeration in European homes and shops of the 1950s and 60s. It was not until the last 20 years, at most 30, that most Europeans lived the crucial transformation of their homes and kitchens in lighting, heating, ease of movement and labor-saving devices, in stoves and ovens with thermostats that didn't have to be watched all the time, in refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, even self-wringing mops. It was the women who benefited most from these improvements, so that one must suppose critics of labor-saving devices to be mostly curmudgeons of the male sex. And it is another point in our century's favor that it saw great strides in the emancipation of half of the human race. The work performed by women became less demanding. Their dress became less constricting as elastic rubber replaced whalebone and lacing in foundation garments around 1905, as bras shortened the corset around 1914, as skirts lightened and rose after 1917. Even beautification was democratized when lipsticks in disposable metal cartridges appeared in 1915, but far more so by the appearance of artificial silk fibers in 1910 and then nylon stockings in 1939, which inspired immortal lines that I quote from memory. When as in silk my Julia goes that is composed of cellulose, the fibers of her garb and hose, designed for her by jewels and sea, oh, how her beauty fetches me. But the fundamental emancipator of women, long yearned for, really came in 1956 with the marketing of the first oral contraceptive. The pill was far from perfect, but it was more important than the vote because it promised choice and the potential emancipation of womankind from its biological destiny. No small thing. Now, of course, women are not alone in being subject to a biological condition. And in this realm, all mankind has undergone a revolution undreamt of in earlier times, partial reprieve from biological destiny. In our next program, we shall learn more about that and other breakthroughs of the 20th century, as well as some of the century's keenest disappointments. Until then.